Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always excited to dig into something new.
Okay, well, today we're headed to the airport, but not for a vacation. We're going behind the scenes to explore how they assess the risk of wildlife strikes and prioritize those safety measures.
Yeah, it's a system most people probably never even think about.
Right, you just expect to get on the plane and go.
Hmm.
But there's a whole lot of work going on behind the scenes to make sure that happens safely. And get this, it's not just about keeping birds off the runway. There's a whole science behind it.
Yeah, more than you might think.
You'd be surprised. It's not always those big birds that cause the most trouble. Size, flocking behavior,
Yeah.
even what time of year it is. It all plays a role.
Oh, yeah, it's all connected.
So how do airports even begin to figure out which animals pose the biggest threat? Like, where do they even start with that?
Well, they use something called safety risk management. It's the backbone of understanding and mitigating the risk of wildlife strikes.
Safety risk management. Okay, so break that down for me. What does that actually mean? Is it like a giant spreadsheet of every squirrel and pigeon spotted on the airfield?
Well, it does involve data for sure, but it's way more than just a list. It's more like a framework,
Yeah.
a way to systematically identify what they call hazards.
Hazards, okay.
And in this case, hazards are any animals that could potentially lead to an incident with an aircraft.
Right, right.
And then from there, they figure out the actual safety risk,
Okay.
which means they're thinking about two things: how likely a strike actually is, and how severe the damage could be if one does happen.
Okay, so it's not just about whether the animals are there, but it's also about what could happen if they have a run-in with a plane.
Exactly.
All right, so that makes sense. But how do they even calculate those things, The probability and severity? It
Uh,
seems kind of tricky.
It is tricky, but they use a mix of real-world data and expert assessment. So they keep track of all the wildlife sightings, what species they're seeing, how often, where they're hanging out, even how they're behaving.
Like bird watching with a purpose.
Exactly. Bird watching with a very serious purpose. And then they add in other factors like the airport's location, what kind of habitats are nearby.
Oh, right.
Time of year, too. Like, migration can really shake things up.
Totally. So it's like this giant ecological puzzle,
Hmm.
figuring out how all these pieces fit together.
Yeah.
But let's talk about some specific examples, get into the nitty-gritty. The source material had some really interesting case studies.
Oh, yeah. The case studies are great. They really bring it all to life.
Can you walk us through those?
Sure. So each one kind of highlights a different way that airports go about prioritizing their actions. Let's start with the common kestrel. It's a small falcon.
Okay.
And at this particular airport, they were seeing them all the time, like very frequently. So the probability of running into one was pretty high. But because of their small size and the fact that they tend to be solitary birds, the experts figured that the severity of a potential strike, if one did hit a plane, would probably be moderate.
Okay, so high chance of seeing them, but maybe not a complete disaster if one did hit a plane.
Yeah, that's the general idea. Plus, when they looked back at their records, the kestrel strikes that they did have only caused pretty minor damage.
So they wouldn't freak out just because there are lots of kestrels around.
Exactly. This information helps them figure out what to do, what actions to take.
So what kind of steps might they take in a case like that?
Well, they'd probably keep a close eye on the kestrel population and maybe look at ways to make the airfield less attractive to them.
Oh, okay, so like discouraging them from hanging out there.
Exactly. But they wouldn't necessarily jump to a full-scale removal effort.
Right, because the risk isn't really high enough to warrant that.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. Prioritize resources based on the actual level of threat. What about the other case studies? I remember one had something to do with barn swallows. Now those seem like much less intimidating birds.
Oh, yeah, those are interesting. The barn swallows, they were tricky because they were only a problem during certain parts of the year, like during migration.
Ah,
So their probability, how likely you were to see them, was high at some points, but really low the rest of the time. Plus, because they're so small and there was no history of them causing damage, the severity was considered very low.
so it's like a seasonal issue then.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe take steps during those peak migration times, but not stress too much the rest of the year.
Yeah, and their place on the risk matrix would actually shift depending on the time of year,
Oh, that makes sense.
which would then, guide what the airport actually did.
Okay, so we've got the kestrel, pretty frequent, but maybe not super dangerous, and the barn swallows, a bit more of a seasonal thing. What about that third case study? I think that one had a bigger bird.
Oh, yeah. That was the griffon vulture. Now, this is where things get really interesting. There hadn't actually been any recorded vulture strikes at this airport.
I feel like there's a but coming.
But because of their size and because they fly in flocks, the severity of a potential strike, if it did happen, was thought to be really, really high.
Right.
So even though they were kind of new to the airport, the potential damage they could cause was huge.
So it's not just about reacting to what's already happened. It's about being prepared for what could happen.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so what would they do in a case like that, with a new species that's obviously high risk?
Well, that's where they have to be proactive. They wouldn't just wait around for a strike to happen. They would start doing things right away to try to deter those vultures.
Okay.
Maybe modifying the habitat around the airport so it's less appealing, or using hazing techniques, which is basically anything you can do to scare them away.
So even though they're new, they're already on the radar, and the airport's taking action.
Exactly. It's like a constant game of chess,
Trying to see one step ahead.
Yeah, trying to anticipate what's going to happen next.
So these 3 case studies, they show how airports use this risk assessment, this framework, to decide what to do.
Yeah, they're great examples. You've got the kestrel, the barn swallows, and the griffin vulture. It's amazing how each one is a different challenge.
And they all need a different approach, right?
Yeah, the airport has to keep adapting. But how do they bring all this information together?
Yeah, right. How do they make decisions?
Well, that's where this thing called a risk assessment matrix comes in. It helps them visualize the level of risk for each species and then prioritize what they're going to do.
Okay, a risk assessment matrix. So it's not just about knowing there's a kestrel out there. It's about putting that knowledge into a system.
Exactly. And then that system guides what actions they actually take.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this matrix. How does it work?
Well, it's actually pretty simple, but super effective. It takes the probability of a strike, how likely it is to happen, combines it with the potential severity, and then it plots them on a grid.
Okay, a grid. All right.
So think of it like a graph. One axis is like how likely a strike is. The other is how bad the damage could be.
So if something is very likely to strike, A and D, likely to cause a lot of damage, it ends up in, the danger zone.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where you'd see immediate action. In fact, they even have a color-coded system, it's like a traffic light system for bird strikes.
Ooh, I like that. Okay, so green means we're good, yellow means use caution, and red means danger.
You got it. Each color matches up with a different risk level.
Okay.
Green means acceptable, which basically means they don't need to do a whole lot.
Right.
Yellow is tolerable, so that means they gotta monitor the situation, maybe take some steps to prevent anything from happening,
Okay, yeah.
And then there's red, intolerable. That's when things get serious and they gotta take immediate action.
Got it. Okay, makes sense. It's like a visual way to figure out what to do first, right?
Yeah.
So let's go back to our case studies. Our kestrels, our barn swallows, our vultures. Where would they land on this matrix with the colors?
Okay, let's see. Our little kestrel friend, remember, high probability but moderate severity. He'd probably be somewhere in that yellow zone.
Makes sense.
We gotta keep an eye on them, but it's not a total emergency.
Right. What about the barn swallows? Those seasonal guys, not very severe.
Yeah, those guys would probably be bouncing back and forth between green and yellow, depending on the time of year.
Oh, okay.
So during migration, when there are lots of them around, they might edge into that yellow zone, and that's when the airport would have to take some precautions.
Right.
But the rest of the year, they're probably pretty chill hanging out in the green zone.
So they're not just stuck in one spot. They can move around depending on what's going on.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those vultures? I have a feeling they're living in the red zone.
Oh yeah, those guys are definitely red zone residents. Even without any strikes on record, their potential to cause a ton of damage puts them firmly in the intolerable category.
Right.
Immediate action is the name of the game with those guys.
All about prevention, huh?
Yep. Got to stay ahead of the game. So, you see, this matrix helps the airports figure out the risk A and D, decide what to actually do about it,
That's so cool. It's like a decision-making tool right there on a grid.
Right. So it's not enough just to know there's a kestrel out there. You got to understand what that means, what level of risk it presents.
Okay, so then how does that translate into actual action? What do they actually DO at the airport?
Oh, well, that's where things get really interesting. Lots of different tools and tactics they can use.
Okay.
For example, for our kestrels in the yellow zone, remember, they might try habitat modifications.
Habitat modifications.
So removing things that attract them,
Right.
Like potential nesting sites.
Yes.
Or food sources.
Oh, okay, so make the airport less appealing.
Exactly. It's not just about steering them away. It's about understanding why they're there in the first place and making them not want to be there.
Okay, clever, very clever.
Yeah.
But what about, like, actively trying to scare them away? Do they do that too?
Oh, for sure. There are tons of ways to do that.
Okay.
Things like pyrotechnics, loud noises and flashes of light.
Oh, wow.
Sometimes they even use trained falcons.
Wait, hold on. Trained falcons?
Yeah.
At the airport?
Yeah, isn't that cool? They patrol the airfield and basically scare off other smaller birds.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. And then for those really high-risk situations, like with our vultures in the red zone, they might use a combination of things.
Okay.
So they might change the habitat, try the hazing techniques, and they even work with people in the surrounding communities,
Oh, we're right.
to try to manage the vulture populations in the whole area.
So it's a bigger effort than just what's happening right at the airport.
That's a community effort.
Wow, there's so much that goes into this. I'm starting to see how it's this, like, never-ending process of adapting and responding to all these different challenges.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But what about technology? I bet they're using some pretty high-tech stuff too, right?
Oh, yeah. I was just thinking that. There's got to be some cool gadgets in the mix.
Oh, yeah, tons of high-tech stuff these days.
Okay, tell me about it.
Airports are using radar systems, like the kind they use to track weather.
Oh, wow.
But this tracks birds in flight. They're using drones to monitor the wildlife populations around the airport.
Okay.
And they even have laser systems to try to scare birds away from certain areas.
Lasers. Like, is the airport shooting lasers at the birds?
Pretty much.
Ah.
I know, it sounds like something out of Star Wars.
Right.
But it actually works. The birds see the laser as a threat,
Mm-hmm.
and they stay away.
That is so cool. So it's this mix of, like, those more old school methods, like changing the habitat,
Mm-hmm.
and then these really high-tech gadgets, and they're all working together to make the airport safer.
Yeah, for the birds, A&D for the planes.
Exactly. It's amazing how much goes on that we don't even realize. It's like a whole secret world right there at the airport.
It really is. And it's constantly changing,
Right.
As new technology comes out and as we learn more about how these animals behave.
It's incredible to think about all the work that happens behind the scenes,
Mm.
just so we can hop on a plane and get to where we need to go.
It's a huge effort. But there's also the human element, too, It's not just about the technology.
Right, of course, the people.
The wildlife biologists, the air traffic controllers, the pilots, they're all essential to making this whole system work.
And it takes a village to keep the skies safe, or an airport, I guess.
Yeah.
But what about us, the passengers? Is there anything WE can do to help?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes. While we may not be, out there managing wildlife ourselves,
Right.
we can still be part of the solution
Good help.
just by paying attention, If you see something unusual, like a big flock of birds hanging out near the runway, report it.
So if I'm waiting for my flight and I see a bunch of geese by the runway, I should tell someone.
Exactly. It's always better to be safe than sorry. And that kind of information can really help the airport staff.
So it's like we're all part of this system, even if we're just passing through.
We are. We all have a role to play.
Okay. But stepping back for a second, thinking bigger picture,
Mm-hmm.
how do airports balance those two things? The need to keep the plane safe and the need to, protect the animals.
Oh, that's a huge question. And a lot of airports are really working hard to minimize their impact on the environment.
Okay.
So they're doing things like creating habitats that are actually good for wildlife, right around the airport.
Oh, wow. Okay.
They're using sustainable practices, and some are even working with conservation groups to help protect endangered species.
So it's not just about keeping those animals away from the airport. It's about figuring out how to live alongside them.
Exactly, finding that balance,
Yeah.
between keeping air travel safe and taking care of the natural world.
Well, this whole deep dive has given me a completely new perspective on what goes into keeping those skies safe. I had no idea.
I'm glad to hear it. It's such a cool field, so innovative.
Right.
All those people working behind the scenes to find creative solutions and make sure we all get where we need to go safely.
So next time I'm at the airport, I'm going to be looking at everything differently.
I bet you will.
Well, thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive into airport wildlife hazard assessment. I learned so much.
My pleasure. It was great chatting with you. And to everyone listening, safe travels.
Safe travels, everyone. Until next time.